We acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chunangton nations, and lands connected with the London Township and Samburra territories of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Coven Wampum. With this, we respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to these lands, as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustice that Indigenous people endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. Okay, Christy, it's all yours. Connor, just would you please start recording? Thank you.
Okay. Recording started, Connor. Awesome. Okay. Hi. Thank you, Mally. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for having me here. I'm, as was stated, Christy Thompson. I'm a research data management librarian here at Western University. I have experience supporting quantitative and qualitative software. My strength is in quantitative, but I'm the person who supports qualitative software here mostly because no one else seems to be doing it at the moment. If you have any questions following the session, I'll do my best to answer them. Since we have a lot of people here, I may not get to everybody. And Mally and Connor will be monitoring the chat while I present. And if you have any incidental questions, they will hopefully be able to answer them. Also, please be aware that I'm available for appointments if you have questions that are not resolved during the session. You can always feel free to reach out to me later. I'm going to start by giving a quick PowerPoint presentation, which will just give an overview of some of the features of NVivo and doing qualitative research in general. And then I'm going to run through analyzing some qualitative data in NVivo using some of the basic functions of the package. So let's get started. Okay, so introduction to NVivo. NVivo is software for analyzing qualitative data. If you do not want to analyze qualitative data, feel free to sit in, but I'm not sure why you're here. It also has some utility for just organizing large numbers of files, even if you're not doing qualitative analysis, actually, and is also used in systematic and scoping reviews. NVivo is a complex piece of software that's very helpful organizing data in many different formats. It's most commonly used for dealing with large amounts of unformatted text data. However, the real strength of NVivo is that it allows you to bring together many different files and file types into a single project and manage them as a coherent whole. NVivo has a number of tools to make working with qualitative data easier, but for most people, the core of doing qualitative research and the most time-consuming part of doing qualitative research is coding their data. And so this is what I'm going to be spending most of my time on. It's what people spend most of their time in NVivo doing. What coding is chunks of text or images or sections of video, phrases or sentences in interview data, for example, or individual tweets if you're analyzing social media data, are tagged with descriptors that classify them according to some schema. In NVivo, these tags or descriptors are called nodes. Codes can be a priori, which means that before you start doing your research, you come up with a list of terms according to the theory that you're going to be working with, and then apply these codes to your data. Or codes can be inductive, which means that terms emerge as you work through your data. Often you'll find that you end up using both. You'll start with a list of terms that you think are likely to show up in your data and that you're interested in looking for, and while you're working through your data, more will more terms, more ideas will occur to you. Nodes are also used to score cases, which are units of observation. For example, people who responded to a survey. NVivo works primarily with files, sources, cases, and codes. Sources are the research materials that you import into NVivo. These include things like documents containing interview transcripts or PDFs, including things like records or files that you've accessed, administrative files that you've accessed that you want to analyze. It can also include data sets, audio files, video files, images. Memos and framework matrices are things that you can create within NVivo. I'm not going to be getting into framework matrices, they're beyond the level of this workshop. Files containing your source material can be imported into NVivo and stored in an NVivo project. When you import a file, NVivo creates a copy of it and stores it internally. Uploading your source files after importing them does not update them into your NVivo project. So if you import an interview transcript and then later you go back and change the interview transcript because you went back to your notes and realized there were some errors, you need to erase it and re-import it. Another thing about NVivo projects, make sure you back them up regularly. I've had a couple of incidents with people I've worked with where files were, NVivo projects were saved on a network drive and something or other happened to disrupt the connection and the project got lost. Save your NVivo project to a local hard drive if at all possible and regularly make copies of your NVivo project. Just generally good practice for working with data, but this is something that hit me recently when I was working with NVivo for a personal project. I lost a couple of days worth of work. Nobody wants to do that, back things up regularly. Okay, that's files. Coding. Coding allows you to gather material by topic, theme, or case. For example, when you're going through your data, you might see in an interview transcript, a paragraph where your interview subject talked about water quality. So you would select that paragraph and code it to the node water quality. NVivo's ability to handle multiple file types allows you to explore unified themes across many elements of your research. So this is the real strength, again, of NVivo. You bring together multiple different files, you code them all according to some schema, and then you can run a query on the code and have a look at all the different places where something relating to water quality or psychological testing or how people conceptualize artwork, all the different places where that theme comes up in your data. You can explore these themes across multiple different areas of your research. Case codes allow you to record information about people, places, or other cases. So for example, if your data consists largely of interview transcripts, you could use case codes to record extra information about the people who participated in your interviews or focus groups. You can use these different types of codes together to, for example, to see differences in how male, female, and non-binary respondents talk about water quality. Source classifications let you record information about your sources. For example, bibliographic data, if you're doing some type of a systematic review type of analysis. Survey responses, tweets, and other type of structured data can be organized in spreadsheets using software such as Excel. In order for NVivo to import these spreadsheets correctly, they need to be set up according to a certain format. Files should contain only the data you want to import, organized in rows, with optionally a header row with field labels. No blank rows, no merged cells, no multiple worksheets, no rows that don't match the rest of the file. This is a nice rectangular spreadsheet set up for importing into NVivo. You've got the interview questions or descriptions of them in the top row. You've got the answers to the questions from each interview subject. Everything is rectangular. You don't have any rows that don't match the other rows. You haven't merged any cells or done anything fancy. This is a spreadsheet that will cause errors if you try to import it into NVivo. It's the same one, but somebody who was working with NVivo merged some files, did some running totals that don't match the rest of the file, put in some notes. All this is going to cause problems. Don't do this with the version of the spreadsheet you want to import into NVivo. In addition to spreadsheets, you also will import into NVivo frequently interviews in structured documents. Now, apart from spreadsheets, which have specific requirements, NVivo will import pretty much any document without giving errors. But if you want to take advantage of auto coding and other features of NVivo, setting up your document using paragraph styles can help. A common practice is to have your interviews saved in files with a set of questions and one file for each interview subject. This makes it easy to separate out your cases and record information about your interview cases separately. It makes it easy to tell which interview document goes with which case. If you have interviews consisting of questions and answers, you can use header, H1 and H2 styles on the questions, and then NVivo can create a code for each question. And if you name or number questions consistently across interviews and give your interview subjects short names and apply a header style to them, this will make things easier later on when you want to run queries on, for example, words the different interview subjects used in responses to question 3. Because NVivo can do some auto coding to figure out what the questions are. So here's a document, an interview that's in the process of being set up using header styles in Word so that it can be auto coded. And here we can see a couple of different files that have been coded in similar ways. Q1, connection to down east, is displayed in exactly the same way in the different files so that NVivo will know that Q1, connection to down east, means the same thing in different interviews. Okay. So coding your data in NVivo is an iterative process. Qualitative analysis is generally, it's something that you do, and then you keep doing it. You read through your data, applying codes and discovering ideas, and then something new strikes you, and you find yourself going back to material you've already read through to look at your data with a new lens. That's what inductive coding means. You come up with codes, you go through your data, something strikes you, and you say, oh, this person is talking about this. I should go back and see if any of the earlier people talked about that because I'm suddenly starting to realize that might be important. Coding is the process of organizing your data to make it easier to discover themes and make sense of it. It's an art, not a science. There is no one correct way to do it. Probably the most frequent question I get about doing qualitative research is this a reasonable way to do coding? And the answer is almost always, it depends, which tends not to be a terribly satisfying answer, but is the only one I can usually give. If you are able to talk a little bit more about exactly what you're trying to do, what sort of theories you're applying to your research, how exactly you're setting things up, then maybe we can have a conversation on exactly how you should be thinking about coding your data. But I can't just tell you, oh, you've got data, this is how you code it. One researcher might apply fine-grained descriptive codes, really break things down into tiny little descriptive codes, and then at the end of the analysis, group and condense those codes into broad themes and use the themes to summarize what's been learned about the research question. Another researcher might come in with broad groupings. code all of the broad groupings, and then delve into each of these broader groupings separately to see how different interview subjects conceptualize them. Some people are interested in getting really down into the details. Sometimes that's not what the research is about. And finally, the most important part of qualitative analysis is what takes place in the researcher's head. NVivo won't do an analysis for you. What NVivo does is the same thing that qualitative researchers have been doing throughout history. Before software like this was developed, people would have gone through their data and tagged it using highlighters and post-it notes and writing little notes on things. Now you're doing the same thing by highlighting your data on a computer screen and writing notes to yourself using annotation software. It's nothing new or different. It's just a different way of coding your data. It's trying to make your analysis simpler, but the most important part of qualitative analysis is still the part that takes place in the researcher's head. NVivo software can help make the process of coding, annotating, and keeping track of your data easier, but there's no way to automate the process of making your data make sense. And finally, I will be providing a copy of these slides that will be sent out to you along with the link to the recording when it's available. And I'm just providing links to some different in vivo tutorials, some information on using NVivo, and a hands-on guide to doing content analysis. Content analysis is probably the most commonly used form of qualitative research that people use NVivo for. So particularly if you're a student or you have a student research assistant and you want to get started with content analysis, this might be a useful starting point. Okay. Just quickly skimming through the questions. One person asked, can we make a copy of the analyzed data on NVivo with the nodes and notes made? The data I'm going to be coding in the presentation, there really won't be enough done with it to make that useful, but I will also be showing you briefly. I'm going to be working with some data that comes with NVivo, and I'm going to briefly show you a more heavily coded version that is made available with your copy of NVivo, and you'll be able to access and use that. If you have trouble figuring out how to access and use that, you can always reach out to me. And that is something that can be very useful for seeing how NVivo coding works. So basically, yes, you'll have a copy of coded NVivo data using a default NVivo data set, which is the same one we're going to be working with. Now I am going to share my screen again and get started playing with NVivo. Okay. As a first comment, I want to note that I am using NVivo Pro. I know that some of you may be following along with the trial version. Different versions of NVivo may look a little bit differently, look a little different and work a little bit differently, but I'm only going to be working with the base features of NVivo that should be available in any version, even if you're using something fairly dated. So the functionality should all be quite similar. We're going to be working with the data collection that's part of one of the sample data sets that comes with some versions of NVivo. It's drawn from a 2-year study done between 2008 and 2009 that was undertaken by researchers from the Duke University Marine Lab in Beaufort, North Carolina. This study documented community perceptions of development and land use change on coastal communities in the Down East area of Carteret County. By the way, I'm not going to be looking at the chat at all while I'm going through this part of the presentation. If anything comes up, people can't hear me, or there's something that just looks very bizarre on the screen, or anything else comes up that you think needs to be brought to my attention, please do enter it in the chat, And if Mally or Connor would please unmute themselves to raise whatever point has come up, that would be very helpful. Okay, so we're going to be working with a sample data set that comes with some versions of NVivo. It includes the responses to a survey, files containing the full text of a few in-depth interviews, and a sample of social media data taken from Twitter using the Carteret County hashtag. Again, this is just a small subset of one of the NVivo default data sets. I took it and extracted some files and simplified them to make it easier to play with. And I've sent out a link to this data set, to this sample data set customized for you. So in NVivo, start by creating a new blank project by clicking the new project button. And then you can give it a title, something like NVivo sample project or North Carolina data or whatever you want. Okay. As I mentioned, it's a good idea to save your projects on your local hard drive because I found that makes it a little bit less likely that they will be corrupted if your network connection gets disrupted. But whether you save them there or on a network drive or somewhere else, you should always back your project up regularly. So if you don't like where the data is being saved by default, you can browse to a new location. As you can see, I have a file for NVivo local backups. Save, click OK. Okay. We have a sample project. Now let's get started importing files so we can do something. I'm going to start by importing a survey that was saved in a Microsoft Excel format. It's in that standard data file format with a row being each case, a person who responded to the survey, and each column a question in the survey. And the first row of the Excel file contains column headers. This is a common setup for data being exported from survey software like Qualtrics, and is also how data needs to be organized for importing into the other data analysis software, such as SPSS. So if you just have a survey that was exported from some kind of survey software, this is probably what it looks like already. You shouldn't need to do a lot of work before importing it into NVivo. So to get it, on the import menu, you would go to the survey tab, import, survey, and choose the Excel option. Let's open NVivo survey responses.xls. And welcome to the survey import wizard. It starts by explaining to you a little bit about what it's going to be doing. Your respondents will be stored as cases. Closed-ended questions will be created as case attributes associated with those cases, and open-ended questions will be created as nodes. Click Next. Now NVivo displays your data, gives you a preview of what's going on. You can tell it that it asks how many rows are used for your question headers. If you don't have any, you would say 0. You're allowed to have up to 2. In this case, we're using 1. The other thing it asks is, what order are your dates in? NVivo will automatically detect whether or not a column represents a date of some sort, but it automatically assumes that all dates are in year, month, day format. By looking at the return date, we can see that this is actually in day, month, year format. So you need to check that, change that. And click Next. Where in your project would you like to store your cases? Default is fine. Row ID is, as we can see, fine is a unique identifier for the cases. And your cases will be grouped together in a classification. New classification, survey respondent. Again, that's fine. Okay. Note that NVivo has done a pretty good job of deciding which questions are open-ended and which are closed-ended. Open-ended questions are ones where the respondent typed in an answer in their own words. The open-ended questions are the ones that you actually are going to want to delve into coding. Closed-ended questions are ones where the respondent just chose a response from a list of options, a multiple choice question in a survey, or entered something like a number or a date. So they might have entered their age, or there might be something like survey administrative data, such as the date on which the survey was returned. These are closed-ended. You don't want to code them. Always double check and make sure that everything was detected quickly. NVivo uses a sample of the first 10% of your cases to decide if something is probably closed-end or open-ended. It's generally pretty good about that. The open-ended questions are set aside for further analysis and coding. The closed-ended questions are classed automatically as attributes of the cases. In this case, the closed-ended questions are mostly personal characteristics of the people who responded to the survey, plus the survey administration variables, such as the row ID or the survey return date. It's important that NVivo get these things correct, because if something is incorrectly classified as closed-ended, NVivo will not allow you to code it. Okay, click Finish. NVivo does its thing. As you can see, NVivo's imported the survey. The closed-ended questions are grayed out. The open-ended ones are displayed on a white background and can be coded. At this point, we could skim through some of the survey questions. Again, this is a question about environment in North Carolina in a region called Down East. So the first survey question asks people to describe the natural environment of Down East in their own words. And you could read through it and see that they said things like beautiful, good, beautiful, peaceful, getting worse due to the environmental pollution, and so on. So if we were just getting familiar with our data, this would be the point at which we might want to start thinking about nodes. On the left sidebar at this point, you could go to cases. Click on Case Classifications. At this point, you can look at each survey respondent. For example, survey respondent number 103, according to their row ID. And you could expand that survey respondent's case and see at a glance what the information on that person was. So person 103 was from Straits Township, from the community of Betty. They've been in Down East 1 generation. They're not involved in commercial fishing. They do recreational fishing. They think the pace of development is about right. They're 41 years old, and so on. So this is where you can just look at you can investigate your cases and see what's going on with them. Okay, let's import some more data. This time I'm going to go to Import, Files, because I want to import the Word documents containing in-depth interviews that were done with a handful of respondents. You can select multiple files at once. So here I select the three Word documents with interviews using Control-click, and then click Open. Check the box to create a case for each imported file, because I'm interested in recording data about these interview subjects. Now, By default, NVivo assumes you're just adding more data about the people you already got, about more survey respondents. However, people are not survey respondents. These are interview subjects. We don't know about their township or community. We don't have pre-recorded data in Excel file saying how many generations they've been down east. So we need to create a new case classification for these people. I'm going to call them interview subjects. Each of these different files is going to be classed as a new interview subject. Okay. So basically, again, if you are importing exactly the same kind of thing, recorded in exactly the same way, so a second Excel file with more survey respondents, then you would add to existing classification. Anything else, create a new classification. I'm emphasizing this because for some reason, NVivo always defaults to add to existing classification, and that is very frequently not what you want to do. Maybe if you're adding new interview subjects, that would be what you want to do, but in this case, it's not. Okay. So looking at our files, we now have some survey respondents and we have 3 interviews. Finally, I'm going to go back to import and use the Excel import option to import the social media data that's associated with this project, the data where people tweeted about Carteret County. Although this is not a survey, the data is set up in a similar way because that's how by default survey data is, social media data is imported from Twitter. So again, we go through the survey import wizard. This is not a survey, but it works pretty much the same. Okay, again, we check the date variable. We note that this time it is actually recorded as year, month, day, so we don't need to change anything. Again, our question headers or our Twitter headers are recorded in the first row. Click next. Again, we have to create a new classification. These are not survey respondents. These are people who tweeted about Carteret County on Twitter, so I'm going to call them tweeters. Okay, so you're going through the survey wizard on the left. You create that tweeter classification. And finally, we note that in this case, most of the closed-ended data has to do with Twitter. It's not question, it's Twitter administrative variables such as the tweet ID and user name. NVivo correctly recognized that the open-ended data that you might want to be coding is the open text of the tweet and the biography of the tweeter. Everything else is closed-ended. So again, we could look through some of the data here. Can see what people are tweeting about Carteret County. Again, they seem to be very obsessed with the fact that it's very beautiful. And they're talking about fishing and shrimp and so on. Okay. Now we have data, let's jump into coding. Since this is a study of attitudes towards development, we're going to start by exploring the survey data to get an overall picture of what people are thinking, even before we start coding. I'm going to explore some of the closed-ended data. The survey had a closed-ended question asking what respondents thought about the pace of development overall. NVivo happens to have some fairly limited quantitative analysis capabilities to facilitate handling survey data. So we're going to use those capabilities and create a chart just to get an overall picture of what people are thinking. So you would go to the Explore menu, click on the Charts drop-down and select Charts, and choose Coding and click Next. We're interested in charting one of the closed-ended questions, which NVivo classifies as case attributes. So choose the second option, Coding by Case Attribute for a file, and click Next. This is why it's important that we set up those case classifications correctly. Okay. Now we're at the chart items screen. We need to select the file we want. It happens to be the NVivo survey respondents. Next to the x-axis attribute, you need to select the thing that you want to be coding. So case attributes for survey respondents. And we're interested in people's attitudes towards development. So we select the pace of development survey question. Click OK. Again, only the closed-ended questions can be charted here. Okay. So the y-axis is percentage coverage. Do I want that, or number of references? Coverage is okay. Okay. So click Finish. I could have told NVivo not to bother including unassigned and not applicable in the chart, which would have made things a little bit prettier. But I left them in there to show you what we would get. Okay, so what do people think about the pace of development in Carteret County? Well, about close to 10% of them are undecided as to whether the pace of development is too fast, about right, or too slow. 45%, 46.5% exactly, think that the pace of development is too fast. Smaller percentage, about 24%, think it's about right. A few people want more development, they think it's too slow. And then we've got the people who say that they're unconcerned. They basically don't really care if it's too fast, too slow. You can do all the development you want, and they're not going to really be bothered by it. So that gives us some sort of an overall feeling for what the survey respondents think about development. And it gives us an idea of what kind of things we might want to be looking for in the interviews. The idea of doing a qualitative analysis where we're using interviews and surveys and so on together is to try and get at what's going on here from multiple different axes. So when we look through our interviews, we might want to think about delving into why people think about the pace of development is too fast, and what's going on with the people who think it's too slow. So let's get started coding. First, let's create a couple of nodes for a priori coding. We're going to start by making sure we have some place to put them. NVivo has already set up containers for the case information nodes that it automatically extracted from the data. And it's classified the different questions in the surveys as well. That's part of the auto coding that NVivo does. Now we want to get into the qualitative content and start coding the themes that we're finding in the data. So let's create a new folder and call it themes. So on the left menu, under coding, you right click on codes and choose new folder and call the new folder themes. You could put a description in. I'm not going to bother. Okay. The first thematic code I'm going to create is called pace of development because I've already earmarked that as something I want to be looking at. So right click on the themes folder, click on new node. Pace of development. Okay, let's create a couple of more. I know that people talk on the survey a lot about the natural beauty. And I happen to know that they also talk a lot about environmental degradation. So those are three things I've thought of a priori that I really want to start looking for in my coding. One thing you'll note is that misclick. One thing you'll find out is that NVivo lets you create hierarchies of nodes. You can create a new node underneath a node. So if you wanted, you could create a node underneath pace of development and have a child node for too fast and another child node for too slow. And then you can aggregate coding at children so that you could look at pace of development overall, and then look separately at too fast and too slow. Sorry, not sure why it keeps doing that. Node properties. So I'm going to aggregate coding from children so that I can look at pace of development thoughts overall, and then look separately at the too fast and too slow people. Okay. Let's delve into coding. We're going to start by looking at one of the in-depth interviews. So on the left sidebar, you would go to data and click on files and double click on one of the interviews, the interview with Maria and Daniel. At this point, if you were doing real research, you would just sit with your data for a while. You would read through the interviews one at a time if you hadn't already done that. Or do some overall thinking about things. Since I'm not doing an actual project and we want to get through this seminar today, I'll just delve into coding. So on the left sidebar, make sure that themes under coding is selected so that we've got our themes showing up. I'll show you why that's important in a minute. Let's start reading through. Let's look for something that would work with one of our codes. Okay, here's someone who says, the Lord lives at Cape Lookout. That's probably a thought on natural beauty. So let's select that text by highlighting it with your mouse. And then you can click on the highlight section and just drag it over here and drop it on the natural beauty code. And now we can see that we've coded a reference to natural beauty in one of our files. One reference in one file. Okay, so let's scroll down a little bit more. We can see that people are starting to talk about environmental degradation. You see people trash. I can't stand trash blowing because of what it does to the animals. So we'll code that one to environmental degradation. Everything ends up in the water. This is a very fragile area. I'm going to code that one to environmental degradation too. However, instead of dragging it over to environmental degradation, I'm going to use a different technique for coding. You can also right click and either click code and select the code you're interested in. And another thing you can do when you're reading through the data, water and sewer, I'm going to code that to environmental degradation. Code. This one I'm going to code to recent nodes. And since I've recently used environmental degradation, it's there. So now you can see we've got 3 references to environmental degradation in one file. So let's open another file. Interview with Barbara. Okay, click back in themes. So we've got our handy list of nodes here. Scroll through again. One of the most beautiful beaches and water anywhere. So let's code that one to natural beauty. I like dragging. It's one of the easiest ways for me to do things. However, there's yet another way of coding data, and it's to select the data and then go down here, code at, and then click the checkbox. Okay, so you can see it showed up to natural beauty. So there's 3 different ways of coding data in NVivo. You're doing the same thing in all cases, coding to themes. You can select text, click and drag. You can select text, right click, and either choose a recent node or browse your nodes and find the one you want. Or you can use the one down here at the bottom, select what you want to code to, and then click on this little check box here. You can also uncode using the same techniques. Well, you can't use dragging to uncode. Well, that's difficult. But if you decided you've got this data coded and you coded it to the wrong place, you can uncode it. See, went away from natural beauty, came back. Okay. So that's how you would code with your a priori codes, but you can also do inductive coding and come up with new codes. Let's say you're reading through and you realize people seem to be talking about the water a lot. You decide you don't want to just put the water stuff under beauty or degradation. You want it to be your own code. So let's select some water text dealing with water. And you could right click, choose code again. And this time you want to create a new node. Click on themes because this is still thematic coding you're doing. New node, water. And NVivo creates your new node and automatically codes the text you have selected to it. Okay. Water quality in general. Just a minute. I'm about to get disconnected. I need to deal with that. Okay, that should be okay. Sorry about that. So now we can select the water text and drag it over to the water node. Okay. There's another way to create a new node. Let's say we decide we want to start coding stuff about commercial fishing. Instead of right-clicking, you can click, drag it over to this place that says drag selection here to create a new node. And that's exactly what we're doing. Okay. Okay. Now let's say as you're working through your data, you see something and you decide that text itself makes a perfectly good code. So another thing you can do when you right click is select bigger development. You could right click on it and tell it you want to code NVivo. Now you don't see anything show up here, but if you go back to nodes, bigger development has been created as a code. And if you open node properties, you could move it. Anyway, bigger developments has been created as a NVivo code, but it doesn't put it in themes. It just puts it under nodes. I think there's a way to move it. Don't quite remember. Anyway. So that's coding interviews. You can code your survey responses and your Twitter tweets in exactly the same way. So let's code a few survey responses in exactly the same way. You can select things, becoming poorer, environmental degradation. So now we have references to environmental degradation in 2 different files, in an interview and in the survey. So water quality, runoff, water, pace of development code, and so on. Now, going back to this interview, sometimes as you're working through your data, you may have thoughts about it that are just too complex to capture in a single code, or that you think are kind of singular or one-offs. You can store these thoughts about your data in annotations. So let's highlight some text. Right-click and choose New Annotation. What this does is it opens up a box down below where you can type in what you're thinking about your data here. Okay. Something like, this is interesting and I want to come back to it later. Okay. And then you could create another one. Annotations are created and stored under nodes. They're considered a type of data rather than something to code, rather than nodes that are codes. So if you go under here, you can see that you've got annotation number 1 was applied to your interview with Maria and Daniel, and you've got annotation number 2 applied to your interview with Maria and Daniel. You can double click on it and it'll bring you to your annotation in context. Okay, so now that you've got some coding, one thing you can do is you go back to your codes, double click on one of them. I just double clicked on environmental degradation. And all my data coded in environmental degradation shows up for me. So we can see that we have 3 references coded to environmental degradation in the interview with Maria and Daniel. These codes cover 4.68% of this file. So according to our coding, Maria and Daniel spent close to 5% of their time talking about environmental degradation. In fact, since I haven't done any really complete coding yet, they probably spent more time than that. But if I'd finished this coding, this would be the point at which I'd start seeing who's talking about what and how much. I would find out that Maria and Daniel talk about environmental degradation this much, and then I would see that it also comes up in surveys. And I would be able to read through all the different ways in which people talk about and conceptualize environmental degradation. And this would be the point at which I would start getting a sense for my data. I've got a theme that I'm interested in, and I can explore that theme looking at all the different ways, all the different places in my data that theme is covered and discussed. So this is really the whole point of doing coding, pulling your data together and getting an idea of what's going on. In addition to just plain coding, NVivo lets you do some forms of exploratory analysis. If you haven't got really any idea where to start with your coding, this can be one of the things you might want to do. Or even if you do have some ideas, you might want to do some exploratory analysis just to get a clearer picture of what's going on, or for other reasons, like you might want to use your exploratory analysis as part of putting together a presentation to talk about to other people about what's going on. So let's do a quick word frequency query. This is one of the very simplest forms of qualitative exploratory analysis. So we go to the Explore tab, and instead of looking at these quantitative tools over here, just click on word frequency. Okay. I want to search in selected items. And I think I want to do a word frequency query just on the interviews. So select those 3 interviews, click OK. Display the 1,000 most frequent words. Let's say with stemmed words. I don't want talk and talking to be listed separately. I don't want regulation and regulations to show up separately. I want it to group things like that. Minimum length of 3, so things like of aren't going to show up. Run query. Okay. NVivo shows me the words that came up. The summary just organizes them by how frequently they showed up. So the most common word showing up in here is east. People are talking about living down east. We could also click on the word cloud. What this does is it visualizes what's going on in the data, and people will often use these word clouds as part of displays when they're showing people about their data. You can customize the appearance by clicking on the different default options. Some of them are pretty ugly. That one's not too bad if you don't hate Comic Sans. You can also look at a tree map. This is just more of a different way of visualizing which words show up more commonly. And finally, cluster analysis. This is really hard to see. And why are you not letting me zoom? Okay. So NVivo will display the clusters in different ways. This one's a 3D cluster analysis. This is really messy to look at, but I'm going to show you some more cluster analyses later on that'll be a little bit more sensible. Okay, so if this is a query that we find interesting, this query looking at word frequency in these 3 interviews, we can add the query to the project. Query type, word frequency query. Okay. And it will show up under queries under the search header. So if you want to rerun this query, you can do that at any time. Okay. Now, finally, I want to show you a little bit more about some types of exploratory analysis that you can do. But in order to do that, I need a file that has lots of codes in it. It's very difficult to show you anything interesting in exploratory analysis when I've only coded a handful of cases to a few codes. So I'm just going to go back to File and open an already coded version of this sample project. So environmental change down east, sample project. Okay, so this is a much more complex version of the data we were looking at. It's a version of the data that's been pre-coded. You should be able to access it as a sample project within your own version of NVivo. So let's do a bit more exploring of our data. I'm going to do a simpler cluster analysis. What cluster analysis does is it's a way of seeing which codes relate to other things. So I want to explore how the different codes relate to each other. Okay, I'm going to select nodes. Okay, I want to select these nodes, the ones about attitude, balance, community change, economy, infrastructure, and so on. These are the themes that NVivo pulled in from the data. I'm going to uncheck auto-coded responses and auto-coded social media. I'm not interested in exploring those along with the codes that were applied to the interviews. Okay. I don't want to cluster on word similarity. That's not something people do. I'm going to cluster them on coding similarity. So word similarity clusters codes and cases together if they have words in common. Coding similarity is my favorite. It's the one I use the most frequently. It's the one that clusters codes and cases together if they code many of the same files. So if the word community change tends to get applied to the same text as economy or the same responses, then they'll show up close together. If economy and community change never show up anywhere near each other, they'll show up as far apart. Okay, so here we've got a cluster showing things, how things are coded, what's close together. There's the zoom. Let's zoom in a bit. Okay, so regulations and environmental impacts tend to show up close together. Local knowledge and memorable quotes. So obviously the people who are coding this data set Just had a separate thing for memorable quotes, which might be a node you'd want to use if you come across things that you really are going to want to be quoting in your write-up of your data analysis. And they found that the people who were expressing local knowledge tended to say memorable things, so these things were close together. You can also see that water quality decline and fishing industry decline tended to show up close together. That makes sense. So this is just giving us a picture of what kinds of things might be related to each other. And that's something that might be really interesting to delve into, depending on what type of analysis you're doing. You can display it in different ways. You look at this 3D thing showing how far things are apart. I find that really difficult to look at. So let's click on the two-dimensional chart version, items clustered by coding similarity. Sense of community down east is pretty far away from people who talked about agriculture or infrastructure. I guess that makes some sense. People who are there due to dealing with agriculture may be very different from the people who care more about the sense of community. Another thing you can do while exploring already coded data is get an overall picture of how particular interviews or other files were coded. So let's go back to this project's version of the interview with Maria and Daniel. Okay. See this thing coding stripes up here? If you click on it, you can tell it you want to see stripes for all coding for a file. And what that does is it shows you which areas have been coded to which things. This is a little hard to look at, so you could add highlighting as well. Let's demonstrate all the highlighting. Okay, looks like everything's been coded. Let's only highlight selected items. Okay, I just selected Maria. So we're only seeing the places where Maria's responses were highlighted. It's not very interesting. Let's look at the highlights for local connection. That's kind of more interesting. We can see a lot of things got selected, coded to local connection. Okay, now let's just look. I want to just highlight things that were coded to economy and economy's descendant codes. Nothing else. Okay. So we can skim through and just see which parts of this file were coded to economy. And we can look over into the coding stripes and get an idea of what other things have been coded. Coding density. That's not one of the codes. There is no theme in this data set called coding density. What this does is it shows us the areas in the code file that have been coded the most. So the richest areas of discussion. Okay, so highlight all coding, highlight selected items. Now we could jump just to the memorable quotes. So if you were going through your data later and you just wanted to find those memorable quotes so that you could copy and paste them into your report, that would be a way to do it. Okay. Finally, let's go back to exploring data. Let's chart some of the coding profile. And which file? Chart the 20 most coded codes on Carteret County on Twitter. We'll chart them by percentage coverage. Finish. Okay, now we can see the 20 most coded codes. Tweet. All right, that was obviously one of the auto codes. Negative tweets, economy, natural environment, and so on. NVivo has a few different options for changing the appearance of your charts. You can do this default three-dimensional chart and rotate it a little bit. You've got this other vertical chart. But if you want to put your charts into a presentation, you might not be satisfied, or into a report or a published article, you might not be satisfied with any of these options. So another thing you can do is click on Summary, which shows you the coding and the percentage coverage. Right-click and choose Export List and export this coding chart to an Excel file. Then you would be able to open this Excel file and develop and modify the chart for this data. And basically, sometimes you have to give up on NVivo's included options, export things, and play with them elsewhere. And that's the basis for how you use NVivo. It's a great tool for organizing your thoughts about qualitative research sources. I've shown you how you might use it for analyzing a multimodal project of digitized interviews, data, social media data, and surveys. It can be used to keep track of sources in a literature review. It can be used for documentary research and many other applications. If you're working primarily with unstructured textual data of any sort, or unstructured textual data associated with some quantitative data, it may be a good choice for your research. And that's it. Does anyone have any questions that they would like me to deal with at this point? We can stop the share now, and then if anyone is interested in asking questions, they can unmute themselves and ask.
Okay, Christy, thank you so much for this nice introduction for NVivo software. We have received two questions actually. One is, university provide this software for free for students, or do they need to pay and purchase the license?
The university does not provide it for free for students. However, if you purchase it through the campus computing store, you get a very much discounted version. So there's a discounted version of NVivo is available for students to use at Western. So it's not free, but at least you get a discount. It's much less expensive than buying the commercial version.
Also, grad students can apply for reimbursement through that funding available for graduate student at the Faculty of Education. So if you need to get any information, you can always contact our office or directly Connor. He can provide you wonderful information about that. It's $600 for master's student and $800 up to $800 for PhD students. This NVivo workshop was extremely helpful. Glad to hear that. So if anybody else has any question that we missed, or you can raise your hand or just type in the chat box.
Okay, someone asked if it's possible to get the recording. Connor was responsible for recording it, and it will be made available by the Education Research Office.
Exactly, yes.
I see somebody asked about a question about auto-coding. Can I show you or tell you about it? The main thing I find auto-coding useful for is if you have your data set up using, well, basically it only works on interview files if you have it set up using headers. If you have your data set up using headers and paragraph styles in Microsoft Word, then it will try and find the questions. If you have an H1 applied to every question in an interview, then it will create a code for the question. And then you'll have a code that pulls together question one across all of the multiple different interviews, as long as you have question one worded exactly the same way in each interview. There are a few other auto-coding features, but I honestly haven't used them very much. If you have anything specific you want to ask me about auto-coding, shoot me an email after the workshop is over, and I can try to figure things out. I'm going to just stick my email in the chat.
The question about the recording usually takes about 1 to 3 days, and it'll be up on the website. I can even distribute it to the members of this meeting too, if we like.
I will also, Connor, I'll also send you I can also send you my slides and a text version of the walkthrough that I used for you to share as well.
That would be great. Yeah, we really appreciate it. Any more questions? Okay, seems there is no more question. Thank you so much, Christy, again, for this wonderful workshop. I'm sure that everybody got some information. So if you have any question or concern, you can definitely directly email us or directly email Christy and ask your question. And have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you all for coming.